Hey guys, welcome to the third episode of the Syad Edit podcast. Today, I'm welcoming into my tiny room/studio convert someone who is not only in one of the more trendier fields, merging the disciplines of the arts and sciences, but is also one of my childhood friends, Jyotsna Shivkumar. Hi.
I think that's the nicest way anyone's ever described me ever.
Well, that was a first in me trying to say your full name out loud. Okay, going back to what I was saying. Jyotsna is a senior designer at The Economist, the UK's leading weekly newspaper, and they tend to cover everything from current affairs to politics to the latest technology. And last year, these guys won the Webby Award for making the Health Inclusivity Index, which is a data visualization, a visual analysis of the health landscape of 40 countries around the world. A real-world example of dataviz, which we'll be touching upon in more detail later on. For clarity, I'll be chatting to Jyotsna about the ins and outs of data visualization, design principles utilized in this tool, but also a bit of the cognitive science behind it as well that helps us to understand why dataviz is made the way it is. What we won't be addressing, however, are the methods of collecting and analyzing the data, which goes into the visualization. Anyways, enough from me. Jyotsna, thank you so much for being here. Before anything, for anyone who doesn't know, what is data visualization, or dataviz for short?
So dataviz is actually really, really technical. It's really hard to explain and describe, essentially, without going into the definition. And dataviz is just a way to make information digestible and engaging in a visual way.
Can you give an example of what it might look like if you kind of go to a website where there's a dataviz? What would you expect, basically? Would there be, pictures, or would it be just graphs, or would there be paint us a picture? I
think there's a few sort of subsets to data visualization. The way I see it is essentially just charts and graphs that pretty much take this data and turn it into a visual, right? I think it's going to be a lot of charts, it's going to be a lot of graphs. The one that comes to my head is bar graphs and column charts, right? That's the one that I see the most, and I think that's also the one that's that does the best job of representing the data in a visual way.
So it's interesting because, in essence, all of us have grown up with dataviz, right? In maths and physics, when we draw bar graphs, all of us as children are introduced to these concepts, which are essentially data viz, that have now, it's revolutionized in terms of how it's flourished from what we learn in school to, what we see today with, the advancements of technology. Before I got the buzzword data viz into my vocabulary, I knew what infographics was, first of all. And so what is the difference between infographics and data viz?
I think infographics are a subset of data viz. I see data viz predominantly as charts and visualizations, and maybe that's because of what I do and how I see data and process the data process, in quotes. But I think infographics are also pretty much the same way that they would visualize the data, but in a little bit more, the way that they're done is a little bit more illustrative. So there's lots of more playful elements, I think. Infographics, I think, are a little bit more flourished. There's a lot of fluff to it, right?
Fluff,
yeah, I think it makes it more palatable. And I think the grown-up version of that would be something like a scrolly-telling site.
You do dataviz for The Economist. I was wondering if you could just give us a general rundown of a bit of your background, basically. You started in graphic design, as I understand it.
Yeah, that's right.
And how did you transition into dataviz specifically? Was it did you have any inspirations, or was it that you just kind of fell into it at the right time?
I actually studied design communication, which is, you might think it's just a pretentious way to say graphic design, but it is design of communicating information, okay, right? And essentially, that's sort of how I got into The Economist as well. I was doing a lot of the things that I build now. I was doing all of the social media and stuff to support that and, promote traffic to that site. So that's how I started at The Economist. I've been here about a little over 5 years now.
Oh, wow.
And I didn't think I would stay at a place for so long, but it's just that I've found so much interesting stuff here and so much to learn as I've grown in my career, and to find a place that will facilitate making the change from graphic design to UI design and data visualization is really interesting. within The Economist specifically, we do a lot of, there's a lot of public policy and a lot of research and like academic deliverables like that we produce in-house. And essentially what we do is we take that information and we present it in a way that's palatable to lay people who don't know a lot about the concepts and the things that we're talking about. Yeah. And so making that change from graphic design to UI design was like the first step, which sort of, so I started thinking about how would I visualize this academic deliverable? Like if I had like a report or something, I got into that. Yeah. And then and then we were like, okay, once we get into the report and the actual content of the report, there's a lot of data there. There's got to be a way to make this data a little bit more engaging than just a bunch of charts, right? And that's how I got into dataviz.
Oh my God, that's amazing. That's a really interesting like career path. Why is dataviz important?
So essentially, I think that people are really visual learners, right? They tend to process information that's visual a lot faster, and they tend to retain it a little bit better as well. And that's the same reason why things like mnemonic devices are really good memory tools, because it helps you have like a visual cue to sort of store and retain all of this memory, all of this stuff in your memory center. Yeah. So I think it's a really interesting way to, process data.
So I was doing the research for this and I came across some really cool facts. I'm going to sound like such a nerd because I want to say these out loud because it's so fascinating. But apparently our eyes can register 36,000 visual messages per hour. 90% of the information that's transmitted in the brain is visual. 90%. It takes only 13 milliseconds for the human brain to process an image. And then the human brain processes images, like you implied, 60,000 times faster than text. I just realized everything that I said could have looked really nice in a database. Then like just saying it in a podcast.
I think this is going to be like my weekend project, that I'm just going to take all of these facts, because I didn't know that 60,000 times faster thing. Like this is just a thing that you kind of internalize when you do so much data. Yeah. You tend to look at visuals quicker, and I always thought it was, yes, there is like a certain bias that comes from like being able to see stuff, right? You obviously see it first and process that first before you think about what the actual content of it is.
Yeah, I used to draw out everything because that was the way my memory worked. Like you said, mnemonic, like mnemonic devices. So there's this strategy that I learned about a few years ago called the VARC strategy. So it's like visual, auditory. I think R is for like reading and K is kinesthetic. So it's like different ways to like learn and like remember things. And for me, it was always visual. Like I would literally be that crazy person drawing out all these cells during like my immunology degree. And my friend would be like, you're wasting so much time. Like, you don't get it. I can understand T cells now.
It's a really effective way to learn, which is also why like cognitive development happens in children, like in babies, right? Yeah. And it helps like processing those forms, even if you can't really understand colors and things like that, really help cognitive development because they're processing these visual stimuli.
So I kind of want to talk a bit about like the theories now, the kind of principles that underpin dataviz, like why you design in a certain way. The floor is open to you to kind of, introduce us to any of the concepts. I know I've been reading about Gestalt principles and a couple of others, but which are the core psychosocial theories that you think are quite...
Yeah, I think definitely the Gestalt principles are sort of the core, the crux, right? Okay, well, it's essentially just a theory of how people perceive things, and they tend to form, like, people tend to form patterns based on what they see. There's a few ways in which they do this. The Gestalt principles are one way where these are classified. There's other things like pareidolia, which is when people tend to form, like, they tend to look for human faces in inanimate objects. There's a short film actually that does this really well. It's called The Blue Umbrella. It's like 10 or so years ago old, and it's beautiful, and it really, really condenses this concept. But yeah, it's quite interesting how people perceive things, right? There's certain biases that help you perceive things in certain ways. Some interesting Gestalt principles are like you tend to group things that are similar to each other. So if they're like a similar shape or similar colors, you tend to group them together. So if you see a bunch of red stuff, you're like, oh, okay, that's red stuff, right? Even the way I said it just now is that, okay, it's a bunch of red stuff. If you describe them as if you see circles versus squares, you would group the circles and the squares. So that's how similarity works. There's also like proximity. When things are close together, you tend to group them together. So in the context of dataviz, it's like if you had like a grid of charts, a grid of like say column charts, like bar charts, you tend to group the like if there's 4 bars, you're talking about 4 parameters. If there's 4 bars that are closer together, you tend to group them as like, okay, this is one group of bar charts. In that way, you tend to see even if there's 16 of them, but they're like 4, 4, 4, you see them as 4 separate entities, which actually kind of leads me into good figure, which is when things are seen in a group, they're perceived as a single thing and so simpler, which is really interesting because that's essentially what dataviz does, right? Like you've got a bunch of data, you've got a bunch of, let's talk about column charts because they're the easiest to sort of visualize without any visual cues. But yeah, you tend to group things that are the same color or whatever, but then because they're all the same color or they're all the same height or something like that, you tend to perceive them as a singular thing, which is how you would process an entire bar chart, which is how you would process 10 different bar charts before you read 10 paragraphs of text.
Closure was the one that I came across, that you basically tend to finish things that have gaps in them. So for example, I think the most common example that I saw on the internet was the WWF logo, which was like you have the panda, but it's not like fully formed, but yet your brain
fills in This actually happens in like reading as well, so it doesn't necessarily have to be visual in the way that we're perceiving like dataviz. So with lots of words, you essentially just read like the first word and the first letter and the last letter, and you fill in the word.
That makes sense.
Yeah. There's so many things like proximity in paragraphs. When you see like a long paragraph of text and they're split into a few different, like a big chunk of text with a few paragraphs split into it, you group the paragraphs together. So it's like, it's not just dataviz, right? Because at the crux of it, like the Gestalt principles is like a school of psychology. Yeah. So it's about how people process information. Like it doesn't necessarily have to be like in like visual dataviz.
It's about recognizing patterns and simplifying complex information in a way that's digestible, like you said. Yeah. So pre-attentive processing was something that I came across, which was about how before our conscious brain kind of activates, how like a subconscious absorbs visual cues. Yeah. So it reduces the cognitive load, basically. And I think that, in essence, informs all of the Gestalt principles.
I think this would even precede, like, all of the Gestalt principles and how that works, because, like, people have biases that tend, like, that have them pay more attention to more things than others, right? Yeah. And so you would see it before you even started forming patterns. Pre-attentive processing. That fits in actually really well with the visual attention theory. I really got into cognitive science when I was in uni, when I was writing my dissertation, because I was writing a lot of stuff about, well, my research was about visual, like buyer behavior and visual attention to cigarette packaging between like folks aged 18 to 25. The thing I zeroed in on was, why do people do the things that they do, right? And biases inform a lot of that. And visual attention, like you just said, is informed by these biases. So people tend to see things before they actually see them, and then they form patterns after they actually see them. Yeah. And a way to sort of bypass all of this is to disrupt that flow of attention, right? Like you would see something, you pay attention to it, and then your brain starts to process this information. Yeah. And a way to break this is by disrupting that flow. Right? And so that kind of fed into the pictorial health warnings on cigarette packaging that people actively like gloss over. And that is, again, that's also informed by a bias, right? Like smokers are looking at cigarette packs and they're just kind of like, I know this is bad for me. And they, actively avoid it. And so a way to sort of get into that was to think about why they do what they do, which is, why do they gloss over it? It's because they already know. And if we changed it up and disrupted that flow of, they know that this is what the pictorial health warning looks like, if I were to change that, if I were to apply some other Gestalt principles and disrupt those Gestalt principles, like not have things that are similar, like increase the contrast, increase visual attention.
Like the color contrast.
Yeah, the color contrast. So like if I were to take this photograph and turn it into an illustration and have it so that there's a really high contrast in the colors that I've used, it completely offsets the way you perceive things, right?
Colour's an interesting one because obviously colour's everywhere and people have different associations with different colours. You associate red with passion and anger, and like maybe that's probably through pop culture as well. These associations that we have with colour, whether it's emotional or whether it's like something else, like how does that work and how does that fit into data visualization?
I think it plays on a lot of these understood biases as well. Like everyone knows that red means stop, green means go, right? These are specific rules that have already been established, which in itself is a different school of design as well, like design theory. where you start, where your starting point is the known truths about things. So like, if you were to see if you were to see a button on a screen, you know you have to click on this button because it looks like a button. But why does something look like a button is quite interesting. So I think when you talked about like you are associating colors with brands, I think that's very much intentional and plays on the emotional aspect of stuff, which is why like McDonald's and like food brands have red because it makes you hungrier, because it means like, yeah, so it's a color that talks about like, I mean, it's a color that means passion, it means danger, it means, you know, it's a powerful color. So that's why colors like red and yellow are used for like food brands, the same way that blues and purples that are perceived as trustworthy are used for like healthcare brands.
Okay. And how does that work in dataviz then?
In dataviz, I think it's built a lot on the theory of known truths. So we do something called like a diverging color palette, which is essentially you start with red on one side, green on the other side, where you would talk about something that's good and something that's bad. And you would have a visualization that leans more green to mean good, leans more red to mean bad. Like sequential palettes is how we would use it. But there's also another nuance to it, which is accessibility, right? DataViz now, at least the way I see, but actually, you know what? I don't necessarily think there might be another nuance to this. I think that DataViz now is online. We're in a digimodern era, right? Everything is online. Everything can be interacted with in some form or the other. And so there's another thing that dictates color a lot is whether it's accessible and compliant with a various set of rules. Yeah. Right? So we want to apply these rules. Like we want something to appear positive and something to appear negative. And we want to do that with color. Yeah. We still have to make sure that it's accessible on different types of color blindness and stuff like that. For example, protanopia is a kind of color blindness where you mix up red and green. So they look the same to you. So if you had a divergent palette that was red on one side and green on the other, it looks like a bunch of gray to you. Right? So you can't tell the difference between them. So which is why we started having mutations of this essential color palette, which led us to things like yellow versus pink.
I like the use of mutation, like the word mutation here, because obviously like mutation, you think of like genetic mutation, but it's kind of interesting that you've integrated that here.
Where it's kind of like, it kind of means the same thing, but it's time for the color to evolve.
And in The Economist, do you create graphics for different audiences, or are they normally for one kind of audience? For example, if you're creating a dataviz for a particular article that's only accessible in some regions, or like driving a particular policy, for example, do you take into account who's going to be looking at the dataviz?
There's another nuance here that's very much about brand recognition. So we need to have some consistency across like the entire board. So we always approach something as being universal, which is also a school of design theory, which is that everyone should be able to access everything. I had a mentor at The Economist who was very passionate about accessibility, not just in terms of color, but in terms of adding alternative text to things and stuff like that. And so we very strongly, like as a designer in general, you want to design something that is accessible to everybody. And because the data dictates the values that the dataviz itself has, it's not so much a matter of whether anyone has emotional biases attached to these colors. There's regional biases, there's like industrial biases and all of that stuff. Like I was saying that blue is a really trustworthy color, so medical companies tend to use that because it's perceived as like calm and, you know, things like that. But we wouldn't do that for the data viz because that doesn't really solve the purpose of visualizing the data. And on a larger level, it's about brand recognition as well. All the charts that we produce, actually at The Economist as well, if you see a chart that's produced by The Economist, all of them look like they're produced by The Economist. So if it was taken out of context, again, it's because we're in a digital era, right? People can share anything anywhere. And so you want to retain like the brand.
Yeah, so it's like trying to maintain integrity and like exclusivity, but also trying to also integrate with the design,
which is why like data design systems is such a complex process to think about all of these nuances when you design a color palette that you're going to be using across everything that we build. Right? It's a really interesting thing. There's all of these tests that you have to do about accessibility. And because the emotional value of all of these colors has been removed because the context is going to be provided by the actual data. So you have to think about things like this. You have to think about the commercial aspect of things. You have to think about the accessibility. And that's pretty much the driving force of all of this stuff.
So we've moved a long way in terms of the user experience from static graphs to now scrolly telling. Can you walk me a bit through like what scrolly telling is and how it's kind of changing the way that we're like interacting with data?
Yeah, actually, this is a really interesting question because all of these principles and schools of psychology that we've talked about, these are all like from like the 1900s, right? From the earliest 20th century, which is when we didn't have computers, we didn't have like people interacting with data on a day-to-day basis digitally, right? And so interactivity and being able to to interact with this data is something that's really important. And it's quite a challenge to see how these principles translate into a digital sort of way. And that's scrolly telling is a way to solve that issue that we've got, which is scrolly telling is essentially a scrolling storytelling sort of data visualization. Yeah, at the crux of it, it is essentially a bunch of charts or a bunch of data visualizations that move one from the other and tell you the story of how the data is processed or how the data goes from how they relate to each other as you scroll through a page.
If we start really simple, let's say, let's literally just start with numbers, not necessarily data viz. Like The Guardian, the BBC, like they've started employing this in their journalist stories. And I guess their data is not really data viz per se, but it's just like saying a stat and then using that to like, I guess, guide the reader to
it gives you the chronology.
It gives you the chronology and it helps to structure the story. And I guess with data viz, it becomes even more important because you've got not like one stat, you've got lots of stats and you've got lots of ways to represent this. How does that translate in practice when you're creating something like that?
So essentially, there's some key takeaways from every research program that you would conduct, everything that you do. There's like 3 or 4 main things that you take away from this. And in the case of the Health Inclusivity Index, it's that one country did really well, one country didn't do so well, and then we like sort of dove into why. And I think in terms of scrolly telling, it would be in the same way where we're just like, bam, this is the main piece of information that you need to know, right? And that would be the same way that you would present it in like in some sort of article that's talking about current events or whatever. You would have like the main piece of information, and then as you scroll through it, it gives you a little bit more context. So I think and it gives you like the chronology of everything as you scroll through it. So if I were to say let's say that during COVID, supply chain logistics was a really big problem. Okay, and that's because borders were closed and stuff like that. So even in the way that I'm telling you this sentence, like my first sort of piece of information would be like supply chains were disrupted during COVID. And then as you scroll through it, it will tell you like, okay, these are the particular sections of supply chain and logistics that were disrupted, right? And then as you scroll through it further, it would tell you, okay, how much before COVID or how much during COVID, so that you can compare those two pieces of data to see the drop in supply chain, like logistics or whatever. And as you go through it, it gives you a little bit of the puzzle, like another piece of the puzzle. And then the expectation is that by the time you scroll through all of it, you haven't felt like you've scrolled through an 8,000 word article.
One of the theories I was reading about in terms of like in psychology, like information overload, when you've got too much data and your brain doesn't know what to do with it, mental fatigue,
you're no longer able to process
you can't process it, you can't make decisions, you have decision paralysis. And I think obviously this is quite common, especially in like the younger generation. You know, they grew up with social media, they grew up with like being bombarded by data everywhere.
And instant gratification. Instant gratification. Like people are just kind of like, give it to me now.
Yeah, they don't know where to start when they so scrolly telling is in essence, I guess, solving that problem by walking you through, like it's reducing the cognitive load at one point in time by guiding you through a story. Another buzzword that I came across was chunking, which I don't know if you've come across that before, but chunking is not necessarily for like processing, but also for ease of memory, just being able to like kind of chunk things. So an example would be like a phone number. So the easiest way to maybe remember a phone number would be to like 3 and 4. And so I think when you divide a number into 3 or 4 digits, and then that way your brain is able to structure and organize information for you to remember it. So that's the Gestalt principle. So there you go. So this is obviously, you can tell I know nothing about design.
It's like a really intricate web of like concepts that all come together and form, which is why data viz is so interesting, because it's like, see, at the crux of it, the reason that like art and design are different is because the way I understand it, in art, like form is function, right? And design deals with this constant battle of like form versus function, where every form needs to have a purpose and needs to solve a problem. Like you can't just put something there for it to be there.
So how do you feel about that though? Because like, do you feel like it diminishes your creativity a bit?
I don't think so at all. I think there's a lot of scope in purpose as well. So I think that actually that was why I went into design, because I didn't want to do, like, I didn't want my creativity to be about how I feel. I think it was about getting information to other people, to communicate stuff to other people. And this is a really interesting, there's a really interesting anecdote that I have from why I chose design as a subject. So in 1996, there was a fire at the Düsseldorf airport. And there were like a lot of people died in that fire. And the reason, like they did like an audit of this later, the reason that this happened was because the signages were like hidden. Because the facade of the airport was so nice that the architects didn't want them to be ruined by signages. So people couldn't find their way out.
Oh my God.
And it was because they were like, oh, actually the inside of it looks so nice, let's not put any signs anywhere.
Oh my God, that's crazy.
So, and then there was like, after this audit, there was a whole redesign of all of these signages. And one of my design idols, Eric Spiekerman, and his team designed the signage for the place. And that was sort of my first ever encounter with form versus function and how they work together. So I don't necessarily think that, I don't necessarily believe that something needs to be pretty to solve a purpose.
So I know a little about this because I have a public health background, but now the arts is being used specifically to help people who are suffering from mental health, because there's a lot of evidence out there that people are interacting with art to be able to gain more understanding of themselves. And so it's kind of this like self-prescriptive way of being able to kind of get yourself outside a situation. So it attributes a function to form. Yeah. So I think that's fascinating. And it's only coming up with more and more research as well. And like more of interdisciplinarity, which is dataviz is just interdisciplinarity in all its beauty. It's just science and art that just comes hand in hand together. I just want to say like the health inclusivity index, if you haven't seen this, please go on the website and check it out. It's fascinating. You learn so much. I did not know that India was leading in terms of health accessibility. Apparently 60% of high-income countries score below average for features that support inclusive access. So that's like extended service, hours, home visits, and then medicine delivery, which is insane. I would not have known that unless I had either shifted through the option of like an 800-word article or just seen a beautiful dataviz, which in essence is the Health Inclusivity Index. So yeah, dataviz is great. It just really just gives you data quick and there. That's all what we love.
This was really fun. This was so exciting.
Hey guys, I hope you relished our journey into the world of data visualization. A big thank you to Jyotsna for agreeing to enlighten us on this very compelling field. I've included a couple of further resources in the description, including a link to the Economist's award-winning Health Inclusivity Index, which we touched upon in this episode. And if you liked what you heard, what are you waiting for? Hit that follow button already and share it with any curious friends out there. Unfortunately, this is the last episode of the first series, but don't worry, I'll be back with more exciting treasures from the converging waters of the science and the arts very soon. And of course, if you do have any projects or even people in mind that you'd like to have on the podcast, just drop me a message on Instagram at @thesciartedit. That is THESCIARTEDIT. I'm the producer and your host, Koyal. Thank you so much for listening to the first series. See you in the next one. Ciao!